Good evening. Now, some days ago, we asked you what sort of topics you'd like to see us cover in a series of brief videos. One of the questions which came in was whether we could take a look at what's going on with the Germanic figure of Ymir and the speculated twin sort of etymology and how it might link up to some other Indo-European comparanda. So with that in mind, let's take a look. Now, the reason why I've chosen this particular subject to talk about is because there's quite an array of academic orthodoxy that really does bear very little sensible connection to the mythology, or the comparative mythology especially, which it purports to represent. It's stuff that's been around in the academic sphere for decades, occasionally even more than a century. And nobody's really sort of challenged it because it's a comfortable orthodoxy. You don't do that. It's a foundation upon which other theories are built. And as soon as you start pulling out the cards, the whole thing sort of starts collapsing for some people who've built their entire life's work out of this kind of thing. In terms of the particular thing that needs critical re-examination here, there's two elements to it. The first one, and the major focus for this piece, will be the speculated connection of Ymir with the what would you call them? Primordial twins, founder twins, that sort of concept within the European myth. The second one concerns Ymir's not really, speculated connection, we should say, to another foundational sacrifice which turns up in, again, various other Indo-European cultures, and from there a sort of cosmological resonancy for one of the major deities in question. In order to sensibly discuss this, we need to understand just what the actual mythology is for both, A, Ymir, B, these founder twins, and C, the actual thing that I suspect Ymir actually links to. So, we'll start with those foundational twins. Now, the general typology for this is that the Skyfather deific has a number of children. We call them sons of the sun because it's a pretty accurate description of where they fit into the mythology. Many people are familiar with various examples of this, even though they may not have connected it to that typology in the past. The most famous, of course, is the striker or thunderer. Examples include Indra, Thor, Hercules or Heracles, and other figures like that. Another set of examples include the horse twins, that is to say the Ashvins, if we're in the Hindu understanding, or the Dioscuri, if we're speaking classically, that being Castor and Pollux, or Castor and Polydeuces, to use the ancient Greek. These also tend to have a number of siblings, depending on which version of mythology we're looking at, one of which being a solar princess, Tapati in the Hindu understanding, or Helen of Troy in the Greek, the face that launched 1,000 ships indeed. Another pair which should be there, although don't necessarily turn up with direct attestation outside of the Hindu sphere, are those aforementioned founder twins. In Sanskrit we would call these Manu and Yama. Now Manu is one of those terms that's beautiful precisely because of its pervasiveness. It means man. There's a few other meanings associated with it. It comes likely from, I would suspect, Proto-Indo-European men, which refers to mental, you see the linkage right there, mental activity, spirit, and things of that particular nature. Manu, which is, say, one of the fearsome sort of wrathful spirit, you might say, forms of Rudra, is derived from that same root. I also believe that Minerva, the Roman goddess involved in quite some sagacity and also bellicosity, is similarly derived. Munin of the Germanic sphere should be from that particular same root. You get the idea. Effectively, we could postulate that Manu, or indeed Manus, to use the Germanic, or man, to use modern English, the idea is that they're a thinking being. They have mental activity, they're recognized as such, and therefore it's our self-designation. When it comes to Latin, Homo sapiens sapiens, doubly wise man, which is a wonderfully egotistical way for our species to refer to itself. Especially as Terry Pratchett pointed out, we're actually more pan-narans, that is to say, the storytelling monkey. But more upon that some other time, and possibly with defensive Vanaras, possibly in pajamas, and of course Lord Hanuman. Anyway, in terms of Manu, man, we've just met the Germanic correlate, if you will, Manus. And of course, as I said, these are twins, so there should be another twin associated with this. In the Hindu end of things, this is quite direct. The figure is called Yama. Now, Yama has come to mean death. However, that's not really quite its original meaning. What it is more, well, as we said, twin. Although, to speak more directly, it's more image. In fact, image is directly etymologically cognate with this Yama, which we've just sort of met. So the idea is you have man over here and the image of man over here. It's almost, well, it's literally a mirror image, you might sort of say. Funnily enough, this helps us to track one of the other expressions of this typology. So Romulus and Remus, or to use the older italic, Aimus. That Aimus is once again from the same root which gives us image, which gives us Yama, or in the Avestan corpus, which gives us Yuma. Although they rather vandalized their foundation with in order to jemmy some stuff in, but more upon that some other time. In any case, what we effectively have is two kings. One king rules the race of man, the living world, the world of light, the one we inhabit. That's, of course, Manu, the first man. The other king does something quite radical. He kills himself. Why does he do this? Well, he does it in order to go forth and found a kingdom of the dead, which is an image, if you will, of the world of the living, the realm of life. Somewhere so that we, when we die, can go there and we have a place to go with our ancestors. It's an incredibly noble act which Yama undertakes. It's why he's the first to die, because, well, I suppose somebody had to do it, and it was him. Now, this is interesting because this is obviously the Hindu understanding of things. In terms of the Roman understanding, the more archaic versions of the Romulus and Remus, again, Aimus, mythology, are actually quite cognate with this. So what you have is Remus does in fact kill himself. He carries out what's known as a devotio. Now, devotio is a rather obscure and ancient and terrible oath. The main forms that we have for it are military forms, wherein a Roman general who really needs to win a particular battle carries out the devotio thing prior to the battle, in which he dedicates himself to the gods of the underworld. He basically says, I am going to offer myself as a sacrifice for this battle going as we need it to, which is quite an incredible thing when you think about it. I mean, the idea of sacrificing yourself in battle is, of course, something which any soldier of the ancient world has as an active concern. But the idea of, even if you win, killing yourself, it's a next level of dedication. The Romans really were quite big on that for the civitas. But in terms of that devotio thing, that's one form of it. I believe that there is another, and possibly more general typology around this, self-sacrifice for things that need to happen. Now, we could go into great depth about the Romulus and Remus mythology, how it changed, how we know it changed, and the likely archaic original formats of things. I've already done that in the Sons of the Sun series up on AryaAkasha.com, so we're not going to get into too much of that here. For now, it's enough to know that's basically what happens and leads to Remus, or Aimus, as we said, becoming a sort of Lord of the Dead alongside the better-known Hades, that is, well, in Roman it wouldn't be Hades, of course, Dispater and figures of that nature, which, is, as we've discussed previously, is effectively an expression of Deus Spetare. Slightly indirect in terms of linguistics, but it does match up. But in terms of what happens, you can see this still with the Remuria festival, which has Remus right there in the name, wherein the shades of the dead, forebears of the Romans, come back amongst the living, kind of like our Pitru Paksha in the Hindu sphere. Pitru, Pitru meaning forefather. You can see the father, Pitru, the direct sort of cognate relationship. In terms of Remuria and these Remurians, they are better known today via a slightly later sound shift, whereby Remuria becomes Lemuria, not the sunken continent which the British invented before plate tectonics went on about and Tamil nationalists have seized upon. But that is, of course, where the name comes from, because lemurs, as in the cute creatures from Madagascar, have a name which comes from the ancient lemurs of Roman mythology, which are exactly these ancestral ghosts. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, Remus rules over Remuria, which has these lemurs in it, ancestral spirits, just as Yama rules over Yamaloka, which is to say the world of Yama, which is inhabited by the Pitras, the shades of the dead. Now, in Vedic cosmology, it's actually an overworld. It's near the zenith of the sun, in fact. There's I suppose you might say, a kenning, metaphorical way of referring to the point of the sun's highest descent in the sky as being correlate with Yama's realm in various of the Rigvedic hymnals, the riddle hymnals. So it's quite different to the underworld typology that later evolves. There's a parallel shift in multiple Indo-European cosmologies, whereby what is in the sky winds up being under the ground, possibly because, well, the sky at night time is, it winds up on the other side of the Earth. And if your Earth is not necessarily spherical, then it winds up being underground, what is formerly up there in the night sky. But again, I digress, another subject for another time. I've already looked at it elsewhere. Anyway, the point is, with this general situation of Yama and Manu, Remus and Romulus, and other examples whereby we have them fragmentarily attested, so for example that Yma we talk about with the Avestan sphere, or the Manus which we find mentioned in Tacitus's Germania, even though there aren't always twins, at least present and available for us in these fragmentary forms, we can tell there should be twins. Because, of course, the etymology in the case of Yma matches up directly with this Yama, this image sort of sphere, so there must be an image of something. And as we said, the Zoroastrians chiseled out their Manu figure to sort of make way for Zoroaster and a number of other stuff like that. And in the case of Tacitus's Germania, what I suspect happened is that Manus is mentioned, but there's no Yama equivalent because it didn't come up. I mean, it wouldn't have in terms of talking about who you're directly descended from, because people aren't directly descended from the Yama figure. They're directly descended from Manu. They're directly descended from Manus. So if you're talking about who you are, you say, well, we're mankind, the kindred of Manus, funny enough. And that's where it gets a bit sort of complex, because the fact that there isn't this Yama figure directly attested has led to quite a lot of theorizing as to where this Yama figure should be. One speculative line of reasoning that comes up and does my head in is the idea that the father of Manus in the Germanic corpus is in fact the twin in question. The idea is that Twisto, that is the name, is supposedly going to be basically twin-isto, I suppose, Twisto. It's not entirely linguistically untenable, but the trouble is that it would require a rather curious thing to happen, to go from the Germanic interlocutors of Tacitus saying, yep, Manus is the son of, Twisto, through to the actual original form being Manus is the brother of Twisto. It doesn't really make sense. Like, it's not impossible that things may have shifted in quite dramatic fashion at some point between the archaic Germanic tradition, continental Germanic tradition, I should add, being reported to Tacitus and Tacitus writing things down. But it's a pretty sort of tall order, and it's, as I say, it's effectively rooted upon A, speculative etymology, which is contestable, and B, the idea that, there should be a twin, which is, I believe, correct, and that, sort of it must be one that's directly attested in the very fragmentary thing we have, as opposed to existing off on the sort of the sidelines for the purposes of, hey, who are we descended from, which I don't think is really that tenable at all, but I digress. Now, to look at this Twisto figure, the best way of approaching it is by setting out, once again, the comparative Indo-European typology. What we have is, as I said, the sons of the sun. So, in the Hindu sphere, we have Surya Vivasvat, Surya the wide shining, Vivas, wide, universal. Svat, as of course you'd be unsurprised to find, meaning that sort of that shine, that radiancy. Surya coming from the same root as Sol and other things like that, meaning the sun. Now, I should briefly mention that what's actually going on there is there's many different gods or other figures that wind up with the accolade of being Surya, depending upon context. So, for example, in this particular instance, the Surya we're talking about is the Sky Father, Dieos Pitara. The interesting thing about this is that the Sky Father, Dieos Pitara, has, as we said, these two horse twins. Hengist and Horsa would be the Odinic form. the Deus Gore in the Greek being descended from Zeus, or Zeus Pater, but you can see the direct relationship with Deus Pater there. And interestingly enough, also in the Vedas, we find the Ashvins being hailed as the sons of Rudra, because Rudra is, of course, Deus Pater, and quite cognate with Odin, as we previously discussed elsewhere. So this particular Surya that we're talking about is, once again, at least in the archaic layers of the mythology, is the Sky Father. And interestingly enough, part of the mythology which involves the conception of the Ashvins actually shows up not only with Zeus in pursuit of Nemesis, which links into Leda and possibly Leto, but also Poseidon in pursuit of Demeter Erinyes. But we've covered that elsewhere. But it's just worth noting that Poseidon is also a Sky Father deific expression. Anyway, so what we're expecting here, in other words, is the Sky Father deific with a solar radiancy, a solar expression. So, can Twisto be a Sky Father figure with a solar expression? I believe the answer is quite unequivocally yes. The reasoning for this is partially because it fits our mythic typology. We have Surya being the father of Manu, and also these other, the Ashvins, etc., who are sons of the Sky Father. And we also have this Twisto being spoken of as the father of Manus. We have this Twisto being celebrated in hymns, to quote in translation, Tacitus upon it, which would clearly indicate he's not a demonic figure. We'll get onto that in a bit later. In terms of the linguistics, there's a well-known D to T sound shift which occurs going from various more sort of southerly or easterly Indo-European languages into Germanic. So, one example of this is dent, that is to say, tooth, becomes, well, you can see it right there, it becomes tooth, so D to T. Another example would be how what we know in Sanskrit as Deva, so Devas in Proto-Indo-European, which means God, generally speaking, becomes Tyr, or Tiwas, to use the Proto-Germanic in, Proto-Germanic for Tiwas, and Tyr is, of course, Old Norse. So, we could see quite easily how something like Deus, which of course becomes Deus, becomes Zeus, becomes the Jew in Jupiter, Deus might in fact become Twisto when we shift into this continental Germanic, which Tacitus was reporting. It all makes sense. We don't have much to go on when it comes to this Twisto figure. The only other major salient detail is that he's referenced as a scion of the soil. Now, I would suspect that scion of the soil in this particular context would mean a ruler of the soil, so to speak. And we do tend to find a pretty pervasive pattern whereby the Sky Father is referred to in such terms. So, for example, if I say Parvati Pataye, Pataye means lord or husband, Parvati means mountain, female, and of course Parvati, as everybody knows, is Lord Shiva's wife. So, Parvati Pataye, lord of the earth, you might say. You could also, there's one etymological approach to Poseidon that is basically the same thing. It becomes, like with how despot basically means sort of master of house. The despot referring to sort of the house thing from, side issue. Poseidon effectively can be understood in a similar way as the master or husband of the earth. It's quite logical. So, Twisto, quite logically, would appear to be a Skyfather figure with what would quite plausibly be this solar sort of facing or theonymic, who is the father of Manu. Now, there is another possibility that's somewhat, it's intriguing, I'll put it that way, and that's that Twisto may in fact be cognate with a Vedic figure by the name of Tvastir. Tvastir is a bit complex, but we'll try and tackle it briefly. Effectively, what we see with Tvastir is that he is a craftsman god, also something of a priest, in fact, one of the first priests we may sort of potentially suggest, who, well, of course, because there's a standard thing whereby smiths, craftsmen, in this archaic end of mythology, they carry out their crafting using tools, namely what we call, Galdra, I suppose, would be the Old Norse form, using vocalizations, using prayer to influence the world around them. It's quite a powerful thing to do. So it's mightiest of weapons, greatest of tools. So in terms of Tvastir, he is a solar craftsman. He appears to be significantly coterminous with the Skyfather deific, oddly enough. So, for example, in various Vedic hymnals, I've written about this extensively elsewhere, so we're not going to go into huge detail, we find Indra basically seeming to approach Tvastir as a father figure, which doesn't necessarily work out too well for Tvastir, but that's another matter. and other inferential information which would appear to suggest such an identification. It's slightly tenuous, but it's definitely there. It's definitely quite a repeated inference, so I think we're on a reasonably sure ground when it comes to it. Tvasthara comes from Proto-Indo-European twerk, which is an odd term to hear in this context, but okay, which means to cut or to carve. Now, the reason why I think that's relevant is if we consider the later Germanic mythology around the first man and first woman, Asgard and Embla, that being the ash tree and the elm, what we find is that they are crafted, they are shaped, carved, perhaps we could say so, figuratively speaking, by Odin working with his brothers, who impart various qualities into these otherwise not necessarily lifeless, but almost barely alive wood which they find along the beach. Figuratively speaking, I do think you could say that they act as craftsmen upon these elements of wood to turn them into humans, via the impartments, as we've discussed elsewhere, of Ond in the case of Odin, which both means wind but also soul, the impartment of Odin by another one of his brothers, which I think, well, it can be read a number of ways, we'll put it that way, and that other quality that very difficult to translate, we'll look at it some other time. Anyway, I do think, therefore, it is plausible on a probative value basis to consider Tvasthara in relation to Twisto, even though my preferred approach to the linguistics would be to just simply directly go, okay, well, it could plausibly be a solar theonym directly, rather than going inferentially via Twisto, who also has some solar conceptry going on, in terms of understanding, well, Tvasthara, I should say, having that solar conceptry, that solar conceptry which we're sort of talking about, in terms of working out who this Twisto is relative to Manus. Now, the reason why I've set all of that up is because the mythology that we have, this comparative approach, sets out quite clearly, as I've said, that the first man and his brother, well, one of them winds up ruling here on Earth. First man sets up social structure, which tends to, interestingly enough, be a group of three, well, whether it's sons in the case of Manus, or whether it's in sort of divisions of society in the case of, say, Romulus, or whether it's other, well, the Dvijavanas in Hinduism with that sort of social structure. A group of three of sort of humanity going forward, as it were. But as I say, more upon that some other time. So the first man is over here, living, ruling, etc. The first to die, his brother, this image, this, I hesitate to say copy, but, sort of this, well, the dying twin, is going forth to found the kingdom of the dead and then rules over everybody eventually, we might sort of say. As was said, the archaic understanding is that the king of the dead kills himself in an act of incredible self-sacrifice in order to go forth and do this thing for us. And in the Hindu understanding is recognized and remembered as a god. In terms of the Roman understanding, I suspect archaically it would have similarly been the case. Certainly the festival is still there, which should suggest it, but I'm not quite sure why, but it seems to have sort of faded out. And along with it, the sort of more reverential approach to the ancestors turning up amongst us, which we have in Pitru-Paksha. Well, Lemuria is not really such a sort of positive time. I mean, you pour the libation, certainly, but it's more apotropaic, so it's warding away the ancestors. And then you go around banging pots and pans to sort of tell them to leave. It's much less positive, as I say, so something interesting has gone on there, but speculation for another time. Also, Manes, in terms of ghosts and spirits, you can see that Proto-Indo-European men particle has once again turned up. I digress. Now, this brings us on to the situation of Ymir. Now, Ymir is, again, a very mysterious figure in terms of what we have not being a hell of a lot. And what we have mostly comes to us from the Gylfaginning, which is to say it's Sturluson's editorializing compilation of a whole bunch of stuff, including a bunch of primary source, well, textual quotations, maybe not quite primary source, but quotations from poetry which were pre-Christianization, I'll put it that way. But he's added a whole bunch of editorial content, explaining some things, occasionally I believe reasonably accurately or at least succinctly, and in other cases not really being quite accurate for whatever reason. One example of the latter is that he talks about how Thor, going out in a fishing boat, kills Jormungandr, decapitates him in fact, according to the skaldic verses which he mentions elsewhere in the edits to draw it all together. And then he goes, yeah, well, some men say that Jormungandr is dead, but I believe it's not the case, and Jormungandr is in fact still alive, still out there to be encountered in the final days of Ragnarok, the war at the end of the world. Now, I've done my research into this, and it appears that Jormungandr is in fact definitely dead. A, because the Proto-Indo-European the Indo-European mythology typology tells us this should be the case. Indra has already killed Vritra. Hercules has already slain the Hydra. You get the idea. And B, because we have all those skaldic verses which talk about Thor having killed Jormungandr already. But of course, the version everybody knows is the one that Sturluson puts forward of, well, it hasn't happened yet. So as you can see, there's a clear case of something having shifted there in the editorializing. In terms of the Ymir side of things, we don't know quite what's shifted because there's simply very little to go on from those more archaic sources that can act as a bit of a check on Sturluson. What we have is effectively that at the start of the world, the great cow, or Dumbler, is forming things out of the ice, you might sort of say. And one of the things which turns up is this great big thing called Ymir. What does Ymir mean? Well, there's a few theories about that, one of which is where all of this academic speculation comes from, is the idea that it means twin, which doesn't really make sense because there's not actually a thing for it to be a twin of. There's no twin there. You wouldn't call a thing twin unless it already had something that it was a twin of. So this, yeah, I mean, I suppose you could say, based around the later mythology, that it's a sort of a dark counterpart to the gods, a demon, you might say. So, for example, in the later Hindu understanding of Asura, which is not Asura, the word that gets applied to various gods and is cognate with Aesir, but it's a later word, a homophone. Asura, that later word, is the opposite to Sura. Sura means, well, shining. It's like sunlight, as previously discussed, like, solar. So Asura is opposite to sunlight. It means demons because they're opposed to the gods that are opposed to sunlight. Makes sense. You could therefore suggest that if Ymir does in fact mean twin, that's what it's riffing off. I don't know about that though. One of the other terms we do have for Ymir is Orgelmir, which appears to mean, effectively a gravelly figure, a gravelly sort of rumbling noise, or a gravelly screamer, we might sort of suggest, which is interesting for a number of reasons which we won't directly go into here. But the point is, the etymology is heavily up in the air and heavily contestable. However, what then happens is, because there is a killing as a foundational act of the world, that being Odin and his brothers going in and killing Ymir, academics will often speculate that, okay, so this must match up with Yama killing himself as a foundational act of the world. Except that it doesn't, because Yama kills himself. Ymir is killed as a righteous action by Odin. It's completely different. Yama also doesn't go away. I mean, Yama winds up, as we've said, ruling over the afterlife, the afterworld, and still very much a god who is worshipped and propitiated, and sort of is the Dharma Raja, looks after righteousness in various ways, a judge of the dead and also of the living. So be careful. But in terms of Ymir, doesn't happen. Ymir gets carved up. Ymir gets distributed, we might say, around the place as various fixtures of the cosmology to come. So it doesn't match. But of course, people like their theories, and therefore we wind up with people insistently trying to say, well, obviously this is the same figure. Now, another typology that shows up here, and this is that third one I mentioned towards the start of the piece, nearly half an hour ago, we should hurry things up, is the idea of Purusha Medha, which is Purusha means man, cosmic man. Medha means sacrifice of. So Purusha Medha means human sacrifice, except in the context of the Rig Veda, there's a particular hymnal which is dedicated to it, which talks effectively about the cosmic man, identifiable with Lord Shiva, basically being split up into all of these things that are in the cosmos around us. Now, on the face of it, it'd be very tempting to go, oh, well, that's exactly like this Ymir business. Obviously, these are the same myth. I don't think that's the case. Now, for a start, it's because, once again, Purusha doesn't wind up, dead, really. Purusha is a living universe. And for a second, it's something which he's actively self-involved in. And for a third, the things that the Purusha sort of splits up into, it's not just, oh, hey, well, okay, the skull dome forms the sky or something. It's a whole bunch of things, including the birds that are flying through the sky, the verses, well, the meters of Vedic poetry come out of him as well. All of these things come out of this cosmic being. And they're still part of this cosmic being, which is still living today. The universe is this cosmic being. Now, this is not something that is exclusive to the Hindu sphere. For example, you can find in the Orphic hymnals quite direct attestation that actually matches up a lot better for cosmic Zeus, who basically has exactly the same stuff going on as this Purusha understanding for Shiva in the Vedas. You can also find in the Atharva Veda very similar stuff when we're talking about Shiva as the Arivracha, the first outlaw, we might sort of say, having very similar stuff when they're talking about this great Vracha, which is, he gets in everywhere because he is everywhere, I suppose you might sort of suggest. So once again, superficially, you might say there's some similarity because Ymir gets, sort of destroyed, well, killed and carved up, and there's various parts of Ymir that are around the place. But these parts don't actually match up very well with what's reported in the Purusha concept tree of the Rig Veda, or these other sort of attestations elsewhere in the Indo-European sphere. Especially because, if we think about it, Odin is Shiva. If you want to find a first outlaw, I would suggest that Odin is probably Exhibit A. Well, actually, Exhibit A is the Adivracha we've aforementioned by about 2,000 years, but that's another matter entirely. Odin is Shiva. It would therefore seem very curious if the fact that the Purusha is understood to be, coterminous with Shiva, that Odin would therefore, kill himself if Ymir was the self being killed, if you follow me. Like Odin killing himself, yes, it does definitely happen. And in fact, we can reasonably marry up that particular narrative with what happens with Lord Shiva and the drinking of the hala hala poison at the churning of the ocean of milk. Because what happens in both cases is Odin hangs himself, which leads to, I suppose you might say, black marks of strangulation about his neck, whereas Lord Shiva drinks the hala hala poison so that it doesn't wind up killing the rest of us, and his wife winds up basically, sort of frantically trying to stop it in his throat, strangling him to do so, which is why he's called Nilakantha, the blue-throated, because that's where the poison sort of still rests, so to speak. So it matches up quite well. There's a bunch of other elements which we could talk about with that myth, but we really should be moving on. The point is, Odin killing Ymir does not really match up very well to what goes on with the Purusha, because the Purusha is definitely a god, Shiva will be the identifiable god, and is definitely still around, still alive, still worshipped. You get the drift. Now, this brings up the next sort of subsidiary point as to why I do not think that either Twisto is Ymir, or, for that matter, that Ymir is, what's going on with this Purusha sort of concept tree, and it's quite simple. Now, the Gylfagunning presents it, and as I've said, this is vulnerable to the accusation that there's some stirless and editorializing going on. I don't know if that's the case. I think it's pretty, understandable, but we'll come on to why that is in a moment. To quote, and Jafanhar answered, "By no means do we acknowledge him God. He was evil, and all his kindred. We call them rhyme giants." Now that's Odin, as Jafanhar, also just as high, being asked a question about Ymir as to whether Ymir is a god, and responding quite directly, no, he's very definitely not a god. He was evil, and he gave rise to this particular race of demons that we're still bedeviled with today. Pretty different, you must sort of suggest, to what goes on with this Twisto figure that we've seen hailed, or at least talked about being hailed, by the continental Germanics as, sort of a god, a forerunner, ultimate ancestor, and celebrated in hymnals as Tacitus presents it. You could say something shifted inside 1,000 years. I don't know. I don't think that's as plausible as this just being a demon that was vanquished. Now, as for why I believe that to be the case, well, for this we must introduce another Vedic typology, which is, once again, a pretty pervasive one if you know how to look. Now, everybody's broadly familiar with one of the classic Chaos Kampf Indo-European monomyths. that being the striker thunderer deity, so Thor, Heracles, you get the idea, and of course Indra. Smiting, the demon dragon of the waters. Vritra is exhibit A when it comes to the Vedic sphere. Now, what Vritra means is enveloper. So it's sort of like a constrictor, you might sort of say. So it winds up sort of enveloping, moving around, obscuring, so on and so forth, covering and encircling the something precious, something which he's got, some ill-gotten. Dragons have hordes. That's basically the way to explain it, I suppose. In this particular case, with Indra contra Vritra, it's the waters, the water cycle. So therefore, once Vritra is slain, there's an immense flood, as of course the water cycle restarts with quite rapid pace. In terms of the mythology, there's actually a bit of a double up, because in addition to this myth over here, we have quite the panoply of dragon slayers attested in the Vedic mythology. So in addition to Indra doing it, there's also Agni does it. We also find Sarasvati does it, Ayuvash, which makes logical sense for reasons discussed quite voluminously elsewhere. And we also find Trita Aptiya, the third son of the waters, doing it, possibly in confederation with Indra, possibly it's a broad typology, effectively. What we also find, however, is that there are other dragons to be slain, one of which is called Vala. Now, Vala is a younger brother to Vritra, and it means encircler, enclosure. In fact, there's other terms that turn up in, say, Avestan, I think from memory, whereby effectively that's what it means, an enclosure, as in a fortification, a space that people can live. I think Yma's apocalypse-proof bunker gets described in such terms, but more upon that some other time. Now, there's a good reason for this, because, of course, the demon dragon in question doesn't just sort of encircle things himself. In the mythology, he often constructs a fort and then hides out in it. It's a cave in a mountain. So the classic children's fairy story, or indeed the Hobbit sort of typology, around a dragon inside a mountain which has ill-gotten gains that must be, you venture into it to sort of smite it. Yeah, it's right there in the Vedas quite repeatedly. So that's a dual layer of encircling, or a dual layer of enclosure, if you will. What winds up happening when it comes to Vala is a situation whereby, actually I'll bring up the hymnal because I really do quite like it. It's a very cool hymnal. So one moment, please. Where are we at? Okay, so these are a few quotes, few lines in succession from Rigveda Mandala 10, Hymnal 68, which is dedicated to Brihaspati, who we'll be meeting in more depth in a moment. As the sun dews with Myth, the seat of order, and casts a flaming meteor down from heaven, so from the rock Brihaspati forced the cattle, and cleft the earth's skin, as it were with water. Forth from mid-air with light he drank the darkness, as the gale blows a lily from the river. Like the wind grasping at the cloud of Vala, Brihaspati gathered to himself the cattle. Brihaspati, when he with fiery lightnings cleft through the weapon of reviling Vala, consumed him, as tongues eat what teeth have compassed. He threw the prisons of the red cows open. That secret name, borne by the lowing cattle within the cave, Brihaspati discovered, and drave, himself, the bright kine from the mountain, like a bird's young, after the egg's disclosure. He looked around on rock imprisoned sweetness, as one who eyes a fish in scanty water. Brihaspati, cleaving through with very clamour, brought it forth like a bowl from out the timber. He found the light of heaven and fire and morning. With lucid rays he forced apart the darkness. As from a joint, Brihaspati took the marrow of Vala, as he gloried in his cattle. Now, to explain what's going on there in somewhat briefer terms, what's effectively happened is Brihaspati has conjured what's referred elsewhere as a Vajra, that is to say, a thunderbolt. Except in this particular context, interestingly enough, the thunderbolt is described as being a meteor, so it's a case of orbital bombardment, just to be sure. What this does is it cleaves open the side of the mountain that is basically where Vala is hiding out with his ill-gotten spoil of cows. Cows being wealth. In this particular case, cows appear to be, in that specific hymnal, correlate with sun elements, although in other hymnals that also correlate with waters. Soma in particular is one element that shows up as we're meeting in due course. So, to bring things back to our typology, what we have is a double-up of Indra doing this, where Brihaspati does the same thing, except whereas Indra is going in swinging with a big club, Brihaspati is using the power of prayer, of Gardara, we might sort of say, to conjure these things which have basically the same effect, but via a slightly different input method, because in the case of Indra, other gods are carrying out the prayer and stuff like that. Vashdevi must be brought on side, of course. In this particular one, Brihaspati is carrying out the prayer himself, which fits because, of course, Brihaspati, Brihas refers to sort of these songs of prayer, the high speech. Pati, once again, lord or husband. So the lord of the songs of prayer. The songs of prayer, of course, being Vachdevi, Vach, voice. The high speech, the divine speech, you get the idea, and so on and so forth. Now, the interesting point about this is that the situation we've just mentioned has a direct correlation in the Ynglinga saga, which is another one of those Sturluson editorialized presentations from the Heimskringla, which, the story of the Norwegian kings, talking about Odin in echumeric terms as a prince of Troy. Now, obviously, some of these facts are incorrect. They're not facts at all. There's a slight point of interest about how, yes, indeed, we can say that Odin did come from an area near the Black Sea and swept up and brought Germanic language with him. But that was some time before the Trojan War, and was a case of the migration of the, so the people from the Urihimat into the Germanic sphere. But I digress. The point is, to quote from the Ynglinga saga, Odin knew finally where all missing cattle were concealed under the earth, and understood the songs by which the earth, the hills, the stones, and mounds were opened to him. And he bound those who dwell in them by the power of his word, and went in and took what he pleased. So, in other words, this directly maps on to what's going on with the situation of Brihaspati opening up the earth to reveal where this wealth of cows is, and then going in, other hymnals make it quite direct that he does this, to actually recover the stolen wealth of kine, of cattle, we should say. As I said, maps up directly. Odin uses these godlike powers, these spells, these songs, you might sort of say, to carry out the accomplished result. The only thing missing in that particular instance is an opponent that must be overcome. And some Vedic verses don't really bother to mention the opponent in direct sort of terms anyway, if memory serves. So it's sort of inferred that there should be one there who's obviously stolen the cows for them to actually wind up being stolen in the first place. I suggest that the most logical person to have stolen some cows for Odin to be going in and rescuing would be a figure by the name of Ymir. A figure who happens to have this name of Orgelmir, which appears to suggest there's something going on with with gravel, with earth, and things of that nature, and who could definitely form an obscuration in that sense for the cow which the god in question would be after. Now that cow would probably be Odumla, the cosmic cow. That's the original cow, indeed. The reason why I say this is quite simple, by which I mean it's very complex, but we're going to oversimplify to attempt to get things through inside and out, since it's coming up on 3/4 thereof. In the Vedic cosmogony, there's a bunch of different cosmological narratives as to how the universe gets going. One that I believe is useful is a rather Shakta one, which basically presents Aditi, the limitless. Diti means sort of limited, Diti opposite of, so opposite of limited, limitless, infinite. Also solar, as it happens, because the sun, of course, is the limitless radiance and its ultimate energy and source. And, of course, the absolute, Rita as Brahman, Brahman being the absolute, is likewise limitless, infinite, Aditi. The goddess, as we've discussed, is directly coterminous and correlate with the in-universe expression of the absolute. In fact, she is the absolute above and beyond the universe, just we get a certain level of it inside the limitations of this universe. I digress. Odumla as a cow. Aditi is also a cow. Odumla has the milk, which of course sustains in multiple streams the fundamentals of life going forward. Aditi, Vashdevi, Saraswati, same deal. Cow, streams, although in that particular case the milk is interestingly correlate with streams of language. It gets understood quite figuratively because, of course, language and song is quite heavily involved in the process of the Vedic cosmology and cosmogony. Twisto, as we previously talked about, Brihaspati, fact, I think from memory, yes, Vishvarupa. No, not Vishvarupa. What am I thinking of? Vishvakarman, that's the one. Yes, so the Vishvakarman Twastara sort of linkage, it's described as a priest. Brihaspati is the title actually used, because he's using this sort of this power of song to sculpt and craft the universe as the foundational series of acts. So Brihaspati being married to Vashdevi makes logical sense. Aditi, of course, explicitly said to be married to Geospitara. So once again, all sort of matches up. And there's an obscure but attested thing around Vashdevi, and of course, Rudra. It all works out together because, of course, Brihaspati is another name for Rudra, as we found attested in the Vedas. The mythology matches up, the theology matches up, you get the idea. So, Odin, Rudra, Brihaspati, same figure. And married to a particular goddess we can describe as a cow. In positive terms, because of course in my religious culture that indeed is a very positive thing to say about a cow. It's well, not just wealth, but also one's mother. In terms of our position as humans, we might sort of say. So yeah, we hold mother incredibly high. There's literally a Sanskrit proverb about how mother and motherland are higher than heaven. So you can see how this cow understanding for the wife of the Sky Father is an incredible honorific indeed. Anyway, I digress. Odumbla, we could suggest, in the original Germanic form of the myth, so before Sturluson sort of got his hands on a form of it, may be being held captive by the demon in question, Ymir. There are some attestations in the Vedas for what effectively amounts to this, whereby a demonic presence, or an interloper we should say, effectively takes prisoner a figure that has, a goddess figure that is related to A, Soma, B, the sun's illumination, as of course we've seen with the situation of Brihaspati just before in Arya 1068. And then, of course, this requires the great god, the Sky Father, to go in and bang heads together, by which I mean banging heads off, in order to recover his wife and the associated cosmological elements that are associated with her. A vitally important thing to do. There are, of course, other myths whereby the wife of the Sky Father actually takes the lead and does the demon slaying herself, but we've discussed those quite extensively elsewhere, so more upon that some other time. Anyway, where I'm linking all this back together on is this idea of Odin going to fight Ymir would therefore match up with this typology quite nicely. A situation whereby the Sky Father goes in to fight and to slay a demonic oppressor that has taken prisoner the cow that is A, his wife, but also B, a cow or cattle that quite directly correlate with necessary fundaments for life in the universe, whether that be the sunlight, whether that be the waters, whether that be these milk correlated things which we've sort of previously discussed. It matches up quite well. In terms of what then happens, of course, and where I think we actually start getting into quite a good clinching of the correlation for Ymir, not only do we have this notion of him being evil and not a god, but we have the thing that happens as soon as Ymir is slain, which, per the Gylfaginning, I shall once again be quoting. And Har answered, "The sons of Bor slew Ymir the giant. Lo, where he fell, they gushed forth so much blood out of his wounds, that with it they drowned all the race of the Rime giants." Apart from one who gets away, but sort of another time. Now, this is interesting because what we have is a situation of this Ymir being slain, followed by an immense flood taking place. If we cast our minds back to the Vedic mythology, this is basically what happens. When Vritra or Vala is slain, the thing that they've been sort of holding on to in their coils is unleashed. The waters come out like an immense flood. In fact, I believe that some of the understanding for Sarasvati, which in the Vedic understanding is Vashdevi Aditi once again, coming forth flood sort of out in that immense sort of irresistible torrent, is basically that same typology. So, what we have, therefore, is a case of the demon being slain, Vritra or Valor, etc., leading to a flood, Ymir being slain, leading to a flood, and of course positive results from there. The question which we would then have is about the next phase of stuff which goes on with Ymir. Because, to quote from the Gylfaginning once again, "They took Ymir and bore him into the middle of the yawning void, and made of him the earth, of his blood the sea and the waters. The land was made of his flesh, and the crags of his bones. Gravel and stones they fashioned from his teeth and his grinders, and from those bones that were broken. And Jafanhar said, of the blood which ran and welled forth freely out of his wounds, they made the sea. When they had formed and made him firm, the earth together, and lay the sea in a ring around, about her, and it may well seem a hard thing to most men to cross over it. Then said Thridi, third, they took his skull also, and made of it the heaven, and set it up over the earth with 4 corners, and under each corner they set a dwarf. The names of these are east, west, north, and south. They then took the glowing embers and sparks that burst forth and had been cast out of Muspelheim, and set them in the midst of the yawning void, in the heaven, both above and below, to illuminate heaven and earth. But on the inner earth they made a citadel round about the world against the hostility of the giants, and for their citadel they raised up the brows of Ymir the giant, and called that place Midgard. Now, the situation that we have here, and why I've just spent all that time quoting that reasonably extensively. First up, we've got that water situation, which we've talked about previously. So the waters after the demon slain go back to the ocean. We can leave aside the blood typology for a moment. Although, interestingly, there is some blood-flowing typology which turns up with the slaying of Vritra. But that's another subject for another time. What we see that is useful is not the stuff about sort of the vault of the sky, etc., because as we've discussed, that's not really how the cosmology works, the cosmogony, we should say, in other Indo-European mythologies. There is, however, a Shatapatha Brahmana mentioned for the head of Vritra being placed in the sky as the moon in a particular ritual understanding. So it's not impossible that the idea of a skull in the sky had something going for it in sort of Indo-European conceptry. It should be noted, of course, that is a ritual understanding rather than necessarily a, strictly speaking, mythological one, and that, of course, Chandra as sort of moon god is a separate thing to what's going on with this Vritra sort of skull in the sky understanding. But I digress. What we are looking at instead is this notion around a citadel, because as we've seen, the situation of Vala tends to turn up not only with literally the demon dragon, or the demon dragon having a citadel in which he lives, but also, linguistically speaking at any rate, we find a mention for sort of Vala as meaning an enclosure, a fortification. It turns up in the Indo-Iranian linguistics. So therefore, what I suspect has happened is we have the mention of a fortification for Vala, or indeed Vala being a fortification as much as occupying one, and it's shown up in somewhat garbled order of transmission when it comes to Sturluson's editorialized presentation of things. So it's almost sort of back to front in terms of the mention for the fortification, Vala, being one of the last things that turns up in connection with Ymir rather than sort of one of the first things that's encountered, because of course the fortification is also a prison where this cosmic cow is being guarded and is being maintained where it is, away from her husband and of course the general divine sphere. Or alternatively, perhaps it's a situation of the immense body and bulk, indeed, of Ymir being utilized to form a fortification just as it had earlier been housed in another fortification elsewhere. Who can say? The point is, with some slight reordering of Sturluson's already somewhat Bowdlerized text, because of course, once again, we've got all sorts of funny things like Odin as a ruler of Troy, I mentioned that particular one, we can make sense of the Ymir typology in a manner that does not link him to being a god, does not link him to being a Skyfather expression, does not link him to being, a twin, point number one. Unless, of course, there was some Vritra figure who was supposed to be a twin of, but that's another matter. But, or indeed, as we said, the counterpart of the gods, the opposite number, which could work, I suppose, but I don't know about that. But instead, suggesting that he is a demonic adversary which fits with this Vala typology that we've just discussed with regard to the Vedic sphere. And who was killed, yes, as a pretty foundational act of cosmic ordering, in order to get the sun shining, as we've seen with the Brihaspati hymn I quoted. I don't believe that the sparks from Muspelheim quite sort of works out in terms of the broader Indo-European comparanda, because we tend to find the eye of the Sky Father that is the sun being exactly that. It's either an eye of the Sky Father, or alternatively it is a son of the Sky Father, the son, we may say, another one of those sons of the sun, or it's the Sky Father himself, or other figures, a daughter of the Sky Father in some context, or an inanimate object, sort of forged to go across the heavens bearing the sun's light. The idea of sparks from Muspelheim doesn't quite sort of track with that general typology, but many things could be meant by it. This is another matter for another time. Anyway, side issue. The point is, the act of killing something as a foundational act of or cosmic ordering is such precisely because cosmic order is able to reassert itself against this demonic and chaotic interloper. The elements that are necessary for life are freed because Ymir has been killed, whether that's the C.A.R aforementioned or various other things we can infer. Similar deal with Vala or Vrtra being killed, which enables the waters to go free, which enables the sun, and so on and so forth. In fact, in one of the now which culture is it? The Kalasha, I think. I'll have to make sure it's them and not their. It's that issue. One of those sort of Afghan hill tribes that people are often sort of fascinated by has a figure that appears both linguistically correlate with figure that the Sky Father in his wrathful manifestation carrying out this kind of actions in order to free the sun and the moon, as one particular further example of this typology in action. In terms of a Greek understanding, you could potentially go that Zeus slaying Typhon, other associated bits and pieces slaying Typhoeus, would be a similar example of the Sky Father taking on this serpentine draconic adversary. Everybody thinks of the sun doing it. Well, it's a case of like father, like son. Lovely poetry. But in terms of, in fact, literally poetry, mythopoetry, in both ancient Greek and Vedic Sanskrit. But anyway, in terms of this situation, as we can see, there's quite a difference between this bellicose, warlike confrontation between the Sky Father deific and other gods on his side versus this demon dragon, this opponent, this adversary. It's a completely different typology to a self-sacrifice in which either the Sky Father may carry out a self-sacrifice, as we discussed with regard to Shiva and Odin, or alternatively, one of the sons of the sun, one of the sons of the Sky Father, i.e. Yama, Ymir, Remus, those sorts of figures carry out a self-sacrifice in order to set up an afterlife. There's no mention of an afterlife being set up as a result of Ymir being killed, is there? Just doesn't sort of seem to happen. So, as we're seeing, three general typologies: that of a demon slaying that's a necessary thing, that of a Sky Father self-sacrifice, and alongside that, Sky Father being correlate with elements of the living universe, and of course the Sky Father's alive after all these things. Ymir is most definitely not. And the third typology is the twin of the first man carrying out a self-sacrifice in order to set up that afterworld which we eventually wind up going to. Three typologies with some overlap in some context in terms of the people involved, but aren't the same thing, despite the ongoing efforts of various people to try and insistently confuse them, often because they either really want to, for some strange reason, worship Ymir as a god and open the doorway to all sorts of demon worship around the place precisely because of it, or alternatively because they're academics who don't happen to have a theistic understanding of the cosmos and therefore just view it as basically rearranging elements completely arbitrarily with no sense for the mythic context in question. In fact, in one of the approaches to this that I've read, if memory serves, the rearrangement takes place by going, well, there should be a cow sacrifice going on here. There's a cow over here and Ymir gets killed. Therefore, obviously, this is some sort of cow sacrifice. Despite the fact that, no, I don't think from memory, and I'm happy to be corrected upon this, there is an understanding of Odumbla being the figure that gets killed in these particular circumstances. Certainly in the Vedic context, you would not expect the cow goddess to be the figure that winds up being, killed, not least because she's life itself and is very much still alive, still around, and so on and so forth, instrumental in one of the other demon slayings, all of the other demon slayings, in fact, that we have mentioned. So, as we have seen, Ymir is not Yama. You can make some sort of attempted linguistic case for it. It's not entirely implausible. but other possibilities are also possible in terms of the linguistics, and in terms of the comparative mythology, it really is just simply not the case that you can say that the myths match up very well at all. There's a death, there's a cosmos, that's pretty much it. It doesn't match up very well. Anyway, I've written about this extensively elsewhere. We'll probably attempt a textual summation of various things we've discussed this evening. Gone a lot longer than I anticipated, but thank you for your time and attention, and keep those questions coming in. Om Namah Shivaya, Jai Mata DJ. See you next time.